All right, so these are toss-ups of authors and works of the part of my study guide which covers authors from James Baldwin through John Updike. I think there are only about 34 or so let's go ahead and get started. Toss-up number one. One character in this play describes a 16-year-old who had made bar-goers laugh by ordering Bergen and water, and discusses his fear that everybody will become the same through rearrangement of chromosomes. In this play, a gun shoots out an umbrella, and a slim-hipped character goes to vomit in the bathroom before the second act, entitled Walpurgisnacht. In this play, Honey and her biologist husband Nick play games such as Hump the Hostess and Bringing Up Baby at the house of an academic couple whose alleged child never existed. For 10 points, name this play, in which George's wife Martha often sings the title question by Edward Albee. And that is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Toss-up number two. This author claimed not to write for the towering dead with their nightingales and psalms, but for the lovers their arms round the grief of the ages in his poem In My Craft or Sullen Art. He described how faith in their hands shall snap in two, and the unicorn evils run them through, in a poem which notes, though lovers be lost, love shall not. Another of his poems says that the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams, while the speaker was young and easy under the apple boughs. That poem ends with the lines, Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. This author of And Death Shall Have No Dominion and Fern Hill wrote a villanelle which urges rage, rage against the dying of the light. For 10 points, name this Welsh poet of Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. And that, of course, is Dylan Thomas. Toss-up three. One character in this novel follows as her daughter is taken around 9 villages by the Oracle of the Hills and the Caves. This novel ends with one character's neighbors refusing to touch him after he hangs himself after murdering a messenger. A 7-year exile results from the disruption of the Week of Peace in this novel, in which Ikemefuna is killed by his adopted father. The Reverend Smith replaces the kinder missionary Mr. Brown in this novel. The protagonist had, in his youth, defeated Amalines the cat in a wrestling contest and fears looking lazy and weak like his father. For 10 points, name this novel about Okonkwo by Chinua Achebe. And that is Things Fall Apart. Toss-up number four. In one story by this author, the 104-year-old General George Poker Sash dies on stage in a wheelchair at a graduation before his granddaughter Sally collects her diploma. In another story by this author, a man sneers, I've been believing in nothing since I was born, to a philosophy PhD who often quotes Malebranche. That Bible salesman, Manly Pointer, steals a wooden leg from Holga Hopewell. In a story by this author of a late encounter with the enemy and good country people, the antagonist tells his mook, Bobby Lee, that it's no real pleasure in life after killing Bailey's family. For 10 points, name this author who created the misfit in A Good Man is Hard to Find. That is Flannery O'Connor. Toss-up five. This author wrote of Fa and Locke, or Loke, who are among the last of the Neanderthals in his book, The Inheritors. In another of his novels, Mr. Campbell and Mr. Davidson note that the title character failed to take off his sea boots, suggesting he hallucinated being stranded. That novel is Pincher Martin. The protagonist of a series of this author's novels befriends Prettyman on his voyage to Australia and falls in love with Marion Chumley, who is traveling aboard the Alcyone. That series of novels centers on Edmund Talbot and includes Fire Down Below and Close Quarters. This author's To the Ends of the Earth trilogy begins with Rites of Passage, but he is more famous for a novel in which Robert is almost killed while pretending to be a boar. In that book, a fighter pilot's body is mistaken for the beast, and a rival group of boys fight over Piggy's glasses and a conch. For 10 points, name this British author of Lord of the Flies. That is William Golding. Toss-up six. In this novel, the protagonist gives another character the record, Little Shirley Beans. Some of the protagonist's more interesting exploits in this novel include being beaten by a pimp named Maurice and waking up to find a former English teacher, Mr. Antolini, patting his head. The protagonist of this work asks a taxi driver named Horwitz, where do the ducks go in the winter, before discussing Romeo and Juliet with a nun. Prized possessions of this novel's protagonist include a baseball glove and poetry written on it in green ink, which used to belong to his brother Al. Its protagonist siblings include his older brother D.B., a screenwriter in Hollywood, and his younger sister Phoebe. For 10 points, name this novel starring Holden Caulfield by J.D. Salinger. And that is Catcher in the Rye. Toss-up number 7. In one of this author's plays, a character scratches his head, like Stan Laurel, when asked to imitate the month of February by a woman who he calls Semiramis. At the end of one of this author's plays, the line, "It's not that way, it's over here," is repeated by the cast at increasing speeds after the stage goes dark. In that play, a character concludes that when the doorbell rings, sometimes there is someone, other times there is no one. That play by this author features a maid who decides that she is Sherlock Holmes, and many discussions of Bobby Watson. This author of a play about the Smiths and the Martins wrote about Berenger's unwillingness to capitulate and transform into a horned creature. For 10 points, name this Romanian absurdist playwright of The Chairs, The Bald Soprano, and Rhinoceros. And that is Eugene Ionesco. Toss-up number 8. This work's protagonist imagines taking a running kick at his wife's rump when she leaves him for a cab driver. At this novel's end, the protagonist weeps as he pays his daughters $4,000 so she and her husband Dick can move to Alaska. He earlier recalls the typhus-inflicted death of a honey-colored first love whom he met at the Hotel Marana, Annabelle Lee. In this novel, sentimental Charlotte is hit by a car after reading her husband's diary, and the protagonist kills Claire Quilty for kidnapping his daughter from the Enchanted Hunters Hotel. For 10 points, name this novel recounting Humbert Humbert's fixation with nymphette Dolores Hayes by Vladimir Nabokov. And that is Lolita. Toss-up number 9. This author wrote about identifying with his young son upon returning to camp in Maine in his Harper's essay, Once More to the Lake. The protagonist of a novel by this man rescues the drowning Applegate Skinner and learns to play taps and reveille while working at Camp Kukuskus. Sam Beaver befriends the mute Lewis, whose father gives him the title instrument in a novel by this man, who also wrote an addendum to a book by another featuring advice like write with nouns and verbs. The title character of one of his novels weaves the words, some pig, to keep Wilbur from being slaughtered. For 10 points, name this New Yorker writer who revised Strunk's The Elements of Style and wrote The Trumpet of the Swan and Charlotte's Web. And that is E.B. White. Toss-up 10. In this play, Betty faints when her father jumps out of a bush and is later examined by a reverend from the town of Beverly. Deputy Danforth questions a man who interrupts the court while his wife is on trial, and the protagonist fails to recite all the 10 Commandments when questioned by Reverend Hale. One character in this work is crushed under stones while asking for more weight, and is named Giles Corey. Mary Warren, a housemaid to the protagonist, brings the puppet doll into the house, leading to Goody Proctor's conviction of witchcraft. For 10 points, name this Arthur Miller play about John Proctor set during the Salem witch trials. And that is The Crucible. Toss-up 11. In this novel, Mrs. Phelps is moved to tears when the protagonist reads Dover Beach, and Mildred is obsessed with her gigantic television set. The protagonist of this work seeks solace with the teenage neighbor, Clarice. The Professor Faber helps the protagonist of this novel escape from the mechanical hound. That protagonist kills Captain Beatty and memorizes parts of Ecclesiastes. For 10 points, name this novel about Guy Montag, which was named by its author, Ray Bradbury, for the temperature at which books burn. And that is Fahrenheit 451. Toss-up number 12. In one short story by this author, 10 high schoolers are blindfolded and set to a boxing match won by Tatlock. That story became the first chapter of this man's only novel that is entitled Battle Royale. One of this author's first works, whose protagonist is a vagrant on a train car to Tuskegee, is Jaime's Bull. The protagonist keeps spinning the titular game's wheel in another story, King of the Bingo Game. He pointed to authors like Conrad and Faulkner in expressing both social and spiritual dilemmas in his work of criticism, Shadow and Act, and the date of abolition of slavery in Texas is the title holiday in Juneteenth. His best-known novel begins with a dozen young black men boxing in a ring for entertainment at a white men's club. For 10 points, Todd Clifton in Roz the Extorter appears in what author's Invisible Man? And that is Ralph Ellison. Toss-up 13. This character briefly worked as a linotypist, and he saved his granddaughter Junie from drowning after the boat capsized. He lived for a time with Jill and her convict boyfriend Skeeter, and he also ran a Toyota dealership. Though not a drinker, this character drinks a daiquiri on a double date with his paramour Ruth and his former coach Totoro. Earlier, this character ran away from his wife Janice, whom he later blamed for the death of his infant daughter Rebecca. He engaged in an affair with his daughter-in-law Prue in the last novel he appeared in, and he was remembered in a novel after that. For 10 points, name this former basketball player the title character of 5 novels by John Updike. And that is Rabbit, or Henry Angstrom. Toss-up number 14. This author wrote about Wayne Williams' murders in Atlanta in The Evidence of Things Not Seen. In one of this author's stories, a math teacher loses his daughter Grace to polio and disapproves of his brother's heroin addiction and jazz piano playing. This man wrote about a bisexual man in Greenwich Village, Rufus Scott, in Another Country, and about a titular homosexual man who kills Guillaume after breaking up with David in Giovanni's Room. This man's essays plays My Dungeon Shook and Down at the Cross are collected in The Fire Next Time. A novel by this author of Sonny's Blues is set during the 14th birthday of the protagonist, who was raised by Gabriel at a Harlem church called the Temple of the Fire Baptized. For 10 points, name this African-American author who wrote about John Grimes in Go Tell It on the Mountain. That is James Baldwin. Toss-up 15. After the protagonist of this play tells his wife he punched a man who called him Walrus, his wife calls him the handsomest man in the world. The protagonist of this play is told that the jungle is dark but full of diamonds by a vision of his deceased brother, who the protagonist chose not to accompany to Alaska. A character in this play drops out of summer school after learning that his father's affair with the woman, and steals a pen from Bill Oliver during a job interview. Despite the efforts of his wife Linda, the protagonist of this play commits suicide to procure a $20,000 insurance payment for his son Biff. For 10 points, name this Arthur Miller play about Willie Loman. And that is Death of a Salesman. Toss-up 16. A novel by this author features the scientist Binet from Saro University in Lagash, who learns about the Apostles of Flame. Alexander Adel and Bertram Lupov pose the title Inquiry for the first time to Multivac in a short story by this man. Roj Nemanu Sarton, a resident of Spacetown, is found murdered in this author's The Caves of Steel. In another of his novels, Harry Seldon's development of psychohistory uses the laws of mass action to predict the future. This author of The Last Question and Nightfall put forth 3 laws for machines in the story of Runaround. For 10 points, name this American science fiction author of the Foundation series and I, Robot. And that is Isaac Asimov. Toss-up 12. This poem was first published in Bouteille Obscure alongside the author's other poem, Lament, which the author remarked formed a contrast with it. This poem was published in the author's collection In Country Sleep and Other Poems, and it variously describes wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, old men whose words had forked no lightning, and grave men near death. This villanelle was potentially addressed to the author's dying father, and it urges the addressee to burn and rave at the close of day, and to rage against the dying of the light. For 10 points, name this most famous poem by Dylan Thomas. And that is Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. Toss-up 18. This man divided certain critics into amazed, peevishly hostile, and universalist groups in his essay Where Angels Fear to Tread, which was later collected in his book Morning Yet on Creation Day. This author wrote a short story in which Jonathan is robbed of 20 pounds, but disregards it because nothing puzzles God. In addition to Civil Peace, this author wrote a work in which the protagonist befriends Joseph and convinces Clara Okiki to undergo an abortion. In that prequel to this work, a family is exiled for 7 years after a gun explosion kills Izudo's son. The most famous novel of this author, of No Longer at Ease, features a character who hangs himself after killing Ikemefuna to avoid trial by Christian missionaries. For 10 points, name this Nigerian author who wrote about Okonkwo in Things Fall Apart. And that is Chinua Achebe. Toss-up 19. 2 children in this short story begin slapping each other after one of them claims the cow-shaped cloud looks like an automobile. A woman in this story talks about Mr. Edgar Atkins' tea garden, who brought her a watermelon with the initials EAT cut into it. In this story, the central characters stop at a restaurant run by Red Sammy called The Tower during their road trip to Florida. A car accident caused by the cat Pity Singh leads to Hiram and Bobby Lee shooting June Starr and John Wesley near the end of this story. For 10 points, name the story in which the grandmother is shot by the misfit, written by Flannery O'Connor. And that is A Good Man is Hard to Find. Toss-up 20. In a play by this author, Grandma is taken by an angel of death after being abandoned in a sandbox. In another play by this author, a character owns 2 cats and 2 parrots, and another character later reveals that he tried to kill his landlady's dog with rat poison. That play by this author ends with Jerry killing himself in front of Peter. In an act this author titled The Exorcism, one of his characters kills his imaginary son with a car accident. In that play by this man, the couple Nick and Honey play games like Get the Guests and Bringing a Baby with George and Martha. For 10 points, name this author of The Zoo Story and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. And that is Edward Albee. Toss-up 21. In this novel, Percival gets sand in his eye after his sandcastle is destroyed by 2 other characters. A character with mulberry-colored mark on his face goes missing during a fire in this novel, which is set during an unnamed war against the Reds. An unseen dogfight in this novel results in a parachutist getting stuck in a tree and casting a shadow that looks like a giant ape. Many characters in this novel live at a place called Castle Rock. A pig's head appears to speak to Simon in this novel, in which a conch shell is destroyed when a boulder hits and kills Piggy. For 10 points, name this work about Jack and Ralph struggling to lead a group of schoolboys stranded on an island, written by William Golding. That is The Lord of the Flies. Toss-up 22. In one story by this author, a soldier begins to regain his faculties after receiving a broken watch and a note that says hello 10 times. One of his characters calls a woman in an elevator to sneak for looking at his feet. A character is married to the superficial Muriel and plays the piano next to Sharon Lipschutz. This author of For Esme with Love and Squalor, Seymour describes the tidal creatures while at the beach in a story by this author, who described the Glass family in Franny and Zoe and A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. This author also wrote a novel in which a character leaves Pensy Prep and returns home to spend time with his sister Phoebe. For 10 points, name this author who portrayed the life of teenager Holden Caulfield in The Catcher in the Rye. That is J.D. Salinger. Toss-up 23. This play opens with a midday meeting in which a man berates his friend for his alcoholism and lends him a tie and a comb. This play's first act sees a grocer obsessively trying to win back the business of a housewife whose cat dies in the ensuing action. In another part of this play, an old gentleman hears that his dog must be a cat from a logician, and that explains syllogisms. Duddard's professional success worries this play's central character, who suggests to Daisy that they repopulate the human race before she leaves him for not understanding love. For 10 points, name this absurdist play by Eugene Ionesco, in which everyone but Berenger grows horns and turns into the title animal. And that is Rhinoceros. Toss-up 24. One of this author's short stories contains the message Icicles by Cynthia, Meter by me, Sybil, in an acrostic device. In another novel by this author, a character tells the story of Gradus, an assassin sent to kill Charles II, the deposed king of Zembla. This author of The Vane Sisters wrote a novel presented as a 999-line poem by John Shade with commentary by editor Charles Kinbote. This author of Pale Fire wrote a controversial novel narrated by the literature professor Humbert, who is attracted to the title Nymphette. For 10 points, name this Russian emigre author of Lolita. That is Vladimir Nabokov. Toss-up 25. This work quotes Robert Louis Stevenson in asking the reader to aim for the moment of felicity. One edition of this text was illustrated in 2005 by Maria Kalman. Gregory Pullum has derided this work as the book that ate America's brain, due to its prescriptivist commands to omit needless words and avoid the passive voice. For 10 points, name this slim volume of advice on grammar and form, edited by E.B. White and first written by William Strunk. That is The Elements of Style, Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. Toss-up 26. In a novel by this author, Jim and Will meet Mr. Cougar and Mr. Dark at a mysterious carnival. The protagonist of a novel by this author aids Professor Faber by memorizing a portion of the book of Ecclesiastes. In a short story by this author, the death of a prehistoric butterfly causes Deutscher to be elected president instead of Keith. This author of A Sound of Thunder and Something Wicked This Way Comes wrote about Douglas Spalding making the title drink with his grandfather in Dandelion Wine. For 10 points, named this author of The Martian Chronicles, who wrote about the book-burning Guy Montag in Fahrenheit 451. And that is Ray Bradbury. Toss-up 27. In one part of this novel, a stakeholder for the state college meets a man who accidentally impregnated his own daughter. The protagonist of this novel gets sent downtown to talk about the woman question after receiving a leg chain from Brother Tarp. This novel's narrator works under Kimbrough and Lucius Brockway, while at Liberty paints after being expelled from college by Dr. Bledsoe. This novel opens with blindfolded black youths donning boxing gloves and pummeling each other in a battle royale. For 10 points, name this novel, whose unnamed narrator notes how his skin color makes others refuse to see him, written by Ralph Ellison. And that is Invisible Man, not The Invisible Man. That is a work by, why am I blanking? H.G. Wells. The Invisible Man, H.G. Wells. Invisible Man with no "the" is Ralph Ellison. Toss-up 28. This author wrote a novel about the psoriasis-stricken Peter and his depressed father, George Caldwell, the latter a representation of the title mythical being. In another novel, this author created the seductive devil, Darrell Van Horn, and the title women, Alexandra Spofford, Jane Smart, and Suki Rougemont, who acquire magical powers. This author described a grocery store clerk quitting his job to impress swimsuit-wearing girls in the short story A&P. He wrote a recurring character who peddles magi peelers and was a former high school basketball star. For 10 points, name this author of The Centaur and the Witches of Eastwick, who wrote about Harry Angstrom in his Rabbit novels. and that is John Updike. I think I said Henry Angstrom up above, which is goofy because of the last 3 years I read all the Rabbit novels. Harry Angstrom, which is Rabbit, and that's John Updike. 28, toss-up. In this novel, Elizabeth regrets telling her late partner that she was pregnant. After looking at a stain on the ceiling, the main character of this novel wonders if anyone has remembered his birthday. One character in this novel has 2 sons named Royal, both of whom are dead. That character, Gabriel, is spiritually reborn at the age of 21 and becomes a preacher. Throughout this novel, Florence keeps Deborah's letter to use as ammunition against her brother. For 10 points, name this James Baldwin novel centering on John Grimes. And that is Go Tell It on the Mountain. Toss-up 30. The set of one play by this author consists of a lone chair in front of a guard tower in a concentration camp to show that the play takes place in Quentin's head. A fight between Rodolfo and Eddie Carbone ends another play by this author. The title character experiences hallucinations in which he speaks to a diamond tycoon, his older brother Ben, in a better-known work by this author of After the Fall and A View from the Bridge. That play sees Howard Wagner fire the father of Biff and Happy, who proceeds to commit suicide so his family can start a new life with his insurance money. For 10 points, name this American playwright of Death of a Salesman. That is Arthur Miller. Toss-up number 31. This story's title derives from a section of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's The Omega Point that argues love will allow humanity to evolve into the divine. A woman in this story goes on a long tangent about the time her father paid off the mortgage for the Goodhighs mansion, which had double stairways. A character in this story wears a hat that resembles a green cushion with the stuffing out and has a purple velvet flap. This story is set during a trip to Mr. Chesney's reducing classes at the downtown Y. In this story, the narrator's mother has a stroke shortly after being struck by a black woman for giving her son Carver a penny. A young man named Julian is the protagonist of, for 10 points, What Story by Flannery O'Connor. And that is Everything That Rises Must Converge. Toss-up number 32. A character with this last name tells a story about creatures that die after eating so much fruit that they can't leave their feeding holes. That man with this last name then shoots himself after entertaining the girl Sybil at the beach. A church made of this material is moved by the title Gamblers of Peter Carey's Oscar and Lucinda. This is the last name of Franny, Zoe, and the protagonist of A Perfect Day for Banana Fish. A unicorn made of this material has its horn accidentally broken off by a gentleman caller visiting Laura Wingfield. A family of J.D. Salinger characters are named for 10 points, what material of the title Menagerie of a Tennessee Williams play. And that is glass. Toss-up 33. One character in this play tells a story about a fox that jumps into a ravine of strawberries and chicken honey before a snake with a knife stabs in the middle of his forehead. The beginning stage directions state that this play is set during an English evening in an English interior with an English fireplace near an English armchair. Late in this play, the maid Mary reads a poem in which everything catches on fire. This play's characters discuss a family in which everybody is named Bobby Watson before being interrupted by the fire chief, who notes that the title character always wears her hair in the same style. For 10 points, name this play featuring nonsensical dialogue between the Smiths and the Martins, which was written by Eugene Ionesco. That is The Bald Soprano. Toss-up 34. There are only 36. A character in this novel describes seeing the punning headline, Red Sox beat Yanks 5-4 on Chapman's homer, thumbtacked to a door. The narrator of this novel describes the reign of Queen Yaruga, who drowned in an ice hole during New Year's Day festivities. This novel's narrator claims that he convinced his friend to write a work in 4 cantos that recounts the escapes of a king nicknamed the Beloved after that friend escaped knew why. The line, I was the shadow of the waxwing slain, is written by a character in this novel who may have been killed by the assassin Jacob Gradus. A self-styled exiled royal from the land of Zembla named Charles Kimboat narrates for 10 points what Vladimir Nabokov novel centering on a 999-line poem by John Shade. That is Pale Fire. Toss-up 35. A short story character spends the night with some of these people and later dies with no hopeful verse upon his tombstone. In a novel about this kind of people, 3 of them conspire to give Jenny cancer in revenge for her marriage to Daryl Van Horn, who has affairs with Alexandra, Jane, and Suki, residents of a small Rhode Island town. Reverend Hale exclaims, I denounce these proceedings in a court case about this kind of people. John Updike wrote a novel about several of these people in Eastwick. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown is about their meetings. Martha Corey and John Proctor are executes on suspicion of being these people at the end of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. For 10 points, name these people who hang out in covens. and they are witches. Toss-up 36, the last. And "Oh, what the hell let him believe there is" tone of voice is used by one character in this play when his wife denies the presence of jail in the basement. One character in this play recalls a soldier offering him dry socks and dismisses any meaning in the wind tearing a tree down. In this play, Frank looks into the horoscope of a missing character and determines he disappeared on a favorable day. This play ends with the patriarch of the central family shooting himself off stage after Anne reads her former lover's suicide note. In this play, Larry kills himself when he finds that his father Joe was responsible for the death of many pilots. For 10 points, name this play about the Keller family, written by Arthur Miller. And that is All My Sons, and that is the total of the toss-ups for this particular section of the Literature Study Guide. Keep learning, keep studying, and hopefully you're getting better.